Hello, my name is Brant Wooten,
And my name is Devin Strunk.
and we are recording this podcast as part of our Dimensions of Equity Google site. For this podcast, we've read a couple chapters out of the book Reading Like a Historian, Teaching Literacy in Middle and High School History Classrooms by Sam Weinberg, Daisy Martin, and Chauncey Montesano. The two chapters that we read out of the book are Chapter 6, Dust to Eat, Dust to Drink, Dust to Breathe, and Dust to Drink, and Chapter 7, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. We will be discussing these two chapters in the context of Dimensions of Equity and also giving a brief summary of the contents and how they can be utilized in the classroom. So Devin, starting off, Chapter 6, Dust to Eat, Dust to Breathe, and Dust to Drink. What did you think about the overall content of the chapter?
Well, it mostly focuses on bringing up the idea that, when we talk about the Dust Bowl, which the title is referring to, that, we only really talk about the people that leave, the migrants who sent away the Okies and the various other groups that left. And this one is attempting to focus a little bit more on sort of perspectives of people that stayed behind. I believe the book states that it was about 7 in 10 people stayed behind, so that's a majority of those that were affected by the Dust Bowl. And then that kind of moves along into sort of talking about, whose stories do we focus on when we talk about particular historical events.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of interesting, that point that we tend to focus, we do tend to focus in popular media on the migrants who left the Oklahoma area, Kansas, during the Dust Bowl. But as you said, 7 in 10 farmers, inhabitants of that region, stuck around. And so I think with things like that, it's really good to ask questions like, why is this the discourse that we're focusing on so much? Mm-hmm. One thing that I found really fascinating about this chapter while I was reading it was thinking about the parallels with modern day. A lot of this is about the overexploitation of the local environment, continuing to overexploit. That was something that I noticed. On good years, planters planted more because they felt that they could make more money. And then on bad years, they planted more, degraded more soil, ended up increasing the severity of this issue because they were hoping to offset the poor harvest that they would receive otherwise.
Yeah, kind of like a vicious cycle.
Yeah, I think in the classroom, that is a detail that could very easily be related to what we're dealing with right now, where we are noticing that carbon emissions are leading increasingly to a feedback loop of higher temperatures, more unstable weather patterns, and yet we're continuing to do much the same thing in the pursuit of ultimately economic stability. But this serves as kind of, in my opinion, a pretty solid example of how that pursuit can lead into severe economic instability, actually.
Yeah. I mean, we're constantly talking about sort of the wildfires in California and, sort of the ecological issues coming from that. Was actually interesting. Another parallel in that regard is there's a section in there where it mentions there were ships out in the Atlantic Ocean that would get dust on them as part of getting thrown up into the atmosphere during the Dust Bowl. And that reminded me a lot of, ships that were kind of far off. I think during the California wildfires, talking about seeing like ash and smoke in the sky, and they're like so far off land that they shouldn't be able to see it. Yeah,
I mean, even us over here, right, like all the way across the continent, we're seeing, I think it was like very, very, very dark red sunsets. Like the sun itself was very muted, and that was because of particulates and smoke from the California wildfires making their way all the way to the East Coast, which is crazy. And I think that it shows that there is no closed system. That's something that in ecology they talk about a lot, right? Like there's no such thing as a closed system, unless you consider the entire planet Earth a closed system. But
yeah,
not even then. We're always being affected by things that are coming from elsewhere. And I think that a lot of the text of this chapter really relates that well, that this wasn't just an ecological disaster happening in Kansas and Oklahoma. It wasn't just an economic disaster happening in Kansas and Oklahoma. Poor management led to severe repercussions nationwide and worldwide, really, when you consider that the ultimate reason why all of this farming was happening in Kansas and Oklahoma was due to a crop shortage somewhere else in Russia.
Yeah, sort of holdovers from during and after World War I. And I think one of the other interesting things that we talk about, like you mentioned, like the everything looking red up in the sky from all the smoke, and because one of the sections it mentions when it's talking about what people kind of blamed for the Dust Bowl and sort of their perspective as individual people. Like some people thought like, oh, this is the apocalypse.
Right.
What have we done to displease God that has, bred this suffering? And then that leads into, sort of people's religion, and that affects their perception of what is happening.
Yeah, I mean, like considering just the imagery of it, like a giant black cloud descends upon your community, wiping out your crops. It does sound biblical when you really stop.
Yeah, and
it's horrifying.
And they mention like the worst of the storms, like they could be up to like 60 miles an hour, and they're like 100 miles across. And it's like, you just imagine just standing in the middle of nowhere, and it's like all you see is like violent like dust coming at you.
Yeah. And I think a really important point to note about the origins of this, right? Mechanization and increasing agriculturalization of the region is a big part of why this happened. But thinking about it like from a multicultural angle, right? There were land management techniques, and even considering your point about the California chaparral, right? Am I saying that right? Chaparral?
I honestly don't know. So.
But like both of these are environments that are pretty severe, pretty drought heavy. And in both of these cases, it's often these European outsiders coming in and applying European growing forest management techniques, agricultural techniques to regions where that's just not gonna fly.
Yeah.
Specifically, like, in England or in France, they've been able to clear cut the land and grow on it in a major way for so long, but we see that isn't adaptable here. And so I think that there's an element where we can discuss on the multicultural education side, what was the land like? How was it managed? How was it worked with before European settlers showed up? And how did that colonization, imperialism, whatever you want to call it, how does that not just affect populations that were living there previously, but affect the quality and use of the land, right? And in the case of Oklahoma, in this region, we've kind of learned from our mistakes as a nation a little bit more. But in California, we're still having massive wildfires, and a large part of that is, one, because of ecological shifts, but also two, years and years and years and years of forest, you could call it mismanagement when you think about specifically what that region needs. That region needs small brush fires regularly to clear out brush so that it doesn't pile up. And actually a lot of fire management techniques, totally well-intentioned, just the same as the Oklahoma agriculture, lead into ecological disasters comparable with what we see in the Dust Bowl.
One of the things I think is interesting, because we kind of talk about, because you also talk about from a perspective of like social justice education that kind of focuses on making past events and connecting them and making them relevant to today. Something in thinking about that concept is that I feel it can also kind of work in reverse, that if you're drawing these comparisons to today, it might make it easier for students to look back at past events and kind of feel a sense of understanding or empathy for the people that are back then and what they're going through, when they can compare it to something that they themselves can feel. It's this feeling of like, like what is going on in this world, and like, what is this event? It's not just something you read in a book, like, oh, this happened and this makes sense. or this thing led to another. And it's like, well, even if one thing leads to another in a sort of cause and effect, you know, people living through that might not know that, or may not be able to know that. And it's going to give you a very different perspective on, you know, what it was like to live through these events.
Yeah, and I think that that's such an important historical thinking skill, right? Hindsight's 2020. We can look back and say, "Oh, it was stupid to farm like that or to do X, Y, Z thing." Like clearly, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
But most, I would say, if not all of these people, especially early on in the settlement patterns, were really just doing what they thought was best and trying to provide for themselves and their families. And so,
Yeah.
I don't like some of the characterization of one of the, I think it was the second author that was brought up. Let me see if I can find his name. The individual who basically like blamed agriculture and mechanization for the Dust Bowl, but didn't look a little bit deeper at the like underlying root of why are people so desperate for the ability to really just make a living, that they are willing to, even after the point where it becomes apparent that this agricultural style is not working well, that they continue to do it, because what else are you going to do? You've already moved out to Oklahoma, right? You can be one of the 3 in 10 that leave for California, or you can hunker down and try to not die for the next 10, 20, 50 years, however long it's going to take. Because also these people don't know how long it's going to take, and they don't know how bad it's going to get. All they know is this is the way that they can hopefully continue to survive.
And one of the things, see, I've never actually read Grapes of Wrath. I was never in an English class that had to do it. I vaguely know what it is through cultural osmosis, but one of the things I remember from people talking about the book, and then also it mentions, you know, Woody Guthrie's songs about the issue. And what I know a little bit of the era is that even those people that went to California, even that often didn't work, because then they were like, there were so many people there just living there already, and then there were so many sort of, you know, ecological or economic migrants at the same time, that even then they were in a horrible situation. So it's sort of like, regardless of what you do, it's going to be rough.
Yeah. So I think in teaching this in the classroom, we can really address a lot of, I would say maybe even all of the dimensions of equity in a single or a series of lessons focusing on this era. For, I think, in particular, social justice is a solid fit. Social justice education, attempting to raise students' critical consciousness. I think that this unit, this historical moment, this way of teaching it, is a really good way of getting kids to conceptualize sort of an alternate story, a different narrative from what they're traditionally taught about this time and place. Especially looking more at the origins of this ecological event, its roots in industry, its roots in agriculture, and its roots in, you know, taking directly from one of the authors presented in it, its roots in capitalism.
Yeah.
And how that drives people to exploit the environment, even when they are increasingly becoming aware that it's ineffective. But also to show them that while this was a mistake that was made, it wasn't one that was made maliciously, obviously.
Yeah.
And it was, in fact, a societal thing that, you know, came about in part because these people were desperate to make a living. That's why they moved out to Oklahoma in the first place, because for whatever reason, the South, the North, wasn't really working for them. And so I think in that sense, we can, as the Dimensions of Equity says, raise students' consciousness about inequity in everyday social, environmental, economic, and political aspects of life. And I think continuing that thread, talking about how does this economic disaster affect the individuals, that's a really good way to discuss how disasters affect more marginalized people earlier on. These are very poor people without any resources. And as we know, those are usually the people that suffer the most in any kind of major storm event, drought, ecological disaster in general. And I think that that is a really solid way to connect this thread to dimensions of equity.
Mm-hmm. And I think just to kind of also make a bit more of a connection to sort of multicultural education, there's also a little bit, it's kind of mentioned in the chapter, but they talk about how there was some people looking at sort of the native peoples of the region. And part of the thing was they kind of understood that it was, no matter how you lived in this area, you had to make sure that the indigenous grassland was protected.
Right.
And they point out that some of the problem was that so many of these people died or were displaced, especially by the time the settlement started in earnest, which is towards the late 1800s, that there was sort of like no one there to kind of show people like, you have to do this, otherwise, you know, it damages the local ecosystem. There was sort of no one there left to really make these like ecological arguments that had come from the native peoples.
One thing I especially also liked in the portion of the chapter that talks about how to teach, they bring up the difference between rating documents and reading documents, right? You have the student who comes in with preconceived notions, things that he's already aware of. Actually, I just realized that that is the next chapter that we're going to be discussing, so I'm going to just edit that part out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of it is, you know, it's talking about, you know, who are we centering and how are their lives different? Because in these people, they were able to survive, you know, in this area despite all of these horrible events. And so it kind of gives you a very different lens of the interaction, because there's no part in this, in like, you know, stories where everyone is packing up and leaving.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the people still have to be, and they have to figure out, okay, what do I do with the situation we're currently in?
Yeah. And I think, you know, thinking in terms of culturally responsive pedagogy, or just being culturally responsive in general, the lesson that we can learn from this, I think a lot, is that in working together, especially, and in building like a community of resilience, these 7 and 10 who remained were, you know, obviously tragedy struck at various times. There was that individual who was smothered by the dust cloud that we discussed, and I'm sure people who, for whatever reason, but in general, the community kind of coming together and working to stay resilient and continue to survive is an important lesson that we can consider when we're talking about culturally responsive pedagogy. When we're talking about how do we get students engaged, how do we have students who have been affected by things, maybe even like ecological disasters. You never know who you get in your classroom. How do we make them more resilient, more capable, and help them become more resilient and become more capable in the classroom? And I think that that's a really good lesson that we as educators can take from this, and also a really good lesson that our students can take from it, part of like the hidden curriculum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That there is a potential, you know, it's not just necessarily hopeless. There are things that can be done to sort of manage these problems.
So moving on, the other chapter that we read, chapter 7, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. I love this chapter. I love talking about this event in this way, because I think that there are very many preconceived notions about the civil rights movement that kind of muddy the waters a little bit. And so I jump at the opportunity to read or teach something that disrupts that narrative and tries to get at the heart of things a little bit more.
Yeah.
One of the most fascinating things that I thought was a really interesting teachable moment, and I think it's actually one of the lesson seeds that is provided at the end of this chapter, was just like, where was Rosa Parks sitting on the bus?
Oh yeah.
Where was she actually sitting? there are so many, and I want, if you're listening to this podcast right now, just like take a second and just decide right now, where is she? Back, middle, front, where is she sitting? Right? And there's so much sort of conjecture that students had in the example provided. For anyone listening along, she was sitting in seat 11, the front of the middle of the bus, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So just behind what is considered the sacred 10, which in Montgomery is these are the 10 seats that are reserved solely for white people.
Even if there are none on the bus.
Even if there are none on the bus,
yeah.
You're not allowed to sit up that close. But there's so much that we're taught in school. Me, when I read it, I was taught that she was sitting at the very, very back of the bus, in like the backmost seat. That is what I remember. I like very, very vividly recall being taught that. Whereas I spoke to my wife while I was reading, and I was just like, "Hey, where do you think Rosa Parks was sitting?" And she was like, "Oh, she was at the front of the bus," because it was like a whole thing. Like she was doing it on purpose, and neither of those are true. And I think that goes to show that these historical myths can become very sort of ingrained in your mind. And I think that in investigating, right, that's where that lesson comes from afterwards. Like, let the students explore. Give them all these sources. Let them decide. Where was she actually sitting on the bus? And in doing that, in learning that skill, that investigation, that critical thinking, right? We're teaching kids to be independent learners, which right off the bat is a major component of culturally responsive pedagogy. And I think it's just an effective tool. It's not something that's like big or grandiose. Does it really super matter where she was sitting? Yes. But is it the most important detail of the story? Not really.
No.
But in having them do that and investigate and figure out like what is the actual truth here, you're teaching them really high quality research strategies. You're teaching them to question things, to look at a resource and say, okay, that's what it's saying, but here's why that might not be true. And I think in an age where, you know, so many students kind of just go through the textbook and that is the word of God. That is the way that it is. Realizing that the writers of books are fallible, the writers of textbooks are fallible, and that there can be details in there that are incorrect or also based on historical myth. I thought that was a very powerful thing right off the bat.
Oh yeah, and it kind of also goes to that, the idea of kind of decentering the textbook, because like using it as a starting point, but understanding that that's sort of, it's going to be based on a potentially overly simplistic narrative, and it's also potentially going to have issues with like what sources are they using, and you know what level of validity are they giving each source, because it even goes on after it explains how the different encyclopedias had different places for things. It even points out that some primary sources tended to disagree, so that gets a lot into sort of, you know, importance of teaching students about sources and being sort of critical and thoughtful in how you're interacting with them.
Yeah. Another thing that I like, can you recall the name of the individual who was focused on, the one who I believe wrote a letter to the governor in this chapter?
I wanted to say it was it Joanne? Let me see, it should be in my notes. Joanne Robinson?
Yes.
I want to say.
I thought that was a really fascinating subject to focus in on with Montgomery bus boycott. You know, if I said it to a random passerby in the street, hopefully they'll say, oh, that's the thing that Rosa Parks was part of. And hopefully they'll relate it to Dr. Martin Luther King. And they'll probably say that it's part of the civil rights movement. But what does that last part mean? Part of the movement. And I think that there's this big thing and it's a result, I think, primarily of great man history, of a history of great men and great events and great women too, obviously, like Rosa Parks here as an example. And while it's certainly true that there are individuals who have been recognized in history for doing important things. That kind of narrative leaves out the collective history of other individuals who are sort of glossed over. And I think Joanne is an excellent example. Joanne was like a force of nature for the civil rights movement in Montgomery. Wrote letters, did a lot really in the background that wouldn't necessarily be in the background if things had shaken up a little bit different. But because Rosa Parks' story was the story that everyone rallied behind, we're taught about Rosa Parks, but we're not taught about Joanne Robinson. And I think that's a fascinating glimpse into a little bit more of like the reality of what it was like being, you know, on the ground during the civil rights movement.
And I think it's also important because there's a lot of, you know, as we talk about like great man or great woman history, there's, I think, a tendency, you know, if you're a student reading this, if you want to get involved in something and you care about something, to like look, if you only see like Martin Luther King or these other people that seem like, you know, big leaders and very charismatic and important, it can make you kind of feel like, you know, you don't have a place in making change. But then remembering like, yes, all those leaders are important as sort of focal points and so forth, but in the end, like it only works because everyone decided to be part of the boycott and of all the work of people at different levels. So it's understand that like you can, regardless of how sort of maybe shiny or important your position is, you know, you can make a difference and be part of making a difference.
And I think when you know, that's a big part of, I'm just thinking about culturally responsive pedagogy as you're talking about that. The whole point is to help students who have been marginalized or maligned by the education system. Generally speaking, these are students who, as a result of societal influences, feel like they have no autonomy, no control, no ability to affect things, affect their lives, affect the systems that they're living under. And by teaching them that things like the civil rights movement, which have been successful, are movements made of individuals who are working towards a common goal, who are not necessarily, it wasn't a movement of thousands and thousands of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s or Malcolm X's, because that's impossible. It was movements of people like Joanne Robinson, or like Rosa Parks, who were just in the right place at the right time and willing to do something about it. And that often, you know, the vast majority of people who made this movement successful don't get their names printed in history books, which is, you know, maybe a failure of history. Maybe it would be impossible to write down everyone's name who contributed in one document.
Just a 1,000-page book just full of names.
Yeah,
you know.
Not have it be just this massive ledger that is borderline unreadable and unusable in the classroom. But I think in teaching more of these, in saying like, look at this individual, right? Like, look at this individual, look at these people here who did this thing. That's why, like, when I teach about the civil rights movement, I like teaching about the freedom riders. You know, collective action or works by many people, basically towards a common goal that eventually was successful. And it wasn't successful immediately, but it was successful because people were dedicated, working towards it. And they don't get their names in textbooks necessarily, not all of them, but that doesn't make the fact that they are important to the history of this nation any less true. And I think in teaching that, you can surreptitiously teach kids that they have the ability to affect things and change things. If they look out and they see that they've been marginalized or affected by the education system or by other systems, and want to change it, but feel like they can't, this is a good way to show them that, like, yes, you can. It is possible. And I think that that's sort of an uplifting thing to show your students.
I think another important thing is, you know, when you look at, because it mentions, it doesn't go into this the way I'm thinking of it, but it mentions in the book that Rosa Parks had an interaction with the same bus driver, like back in the 40s. And this was, I believe it said like 12 years earlier, and she wasn't on the bus for a while. And it makes you wonder, there's that whole thing of like, okay, why didn't that turn into a problem? Why didn't that event in 43 turn into some kind of, rallying point for a boycott, but this one in the 50s did?
Yeah, and I think the truth that so thinking about why the incident in, what was it, 43, didn't become a national movement, but the incident later on in the 50s did. I think that really segues well into discussing how the movement made it so that there was basically made the conditions of individuals living in Montgomery, allowed them to conceive of a boycott like this. I think that there had been a few other successful transportation boycotts in other cities in the South prior to this, which had probably helped them consider that this could be a very real movement that would take off. And so thinking about it historically, right, relating that information that like there was a similar incident that occurred to the same exact woman in a different time, but it didn't become a whole thing, probably has a lot to do with the movement itself surrounding Rosa Parks. I think that's a really interesting question. If people weren't doing things in the civil rights movement between 43 and when Rosa Parks ultimately had this interaction with this bus driver, which resulted in the Montgomery bus boycott. If all of this groundwork hadn't been laid, would we still see something like this occur? Could we still see something like this occur? It's an interesting kind of what if for your students, I think.
And I think part of that is we don't always see sort of the buildup, because we talk about the Second World War, and that sort of happens. And we don't really talk about, you had civil rights leaders, especially the earlier ones, who convinced Roosevelt to, put in where government contractors couldn't discriminate based on race. You have the Pentagon that's in Virginia, and it was built on the assumption it was going to be segregated. And then the federal government said, we're the federal government, we don't discriminate based on race in this context. It's not going to be segregated. And then you have, Truman desegregating the military around the same time before the Korean War starts. So there's a lot of events prior to this that sort of shift what people think are possible.
Yeah. I liked both of these chapters a lot, and I liked them a lot because, like other chapters in the book, and I do recommend that if you are looking into history education or any other, or just interested in history in general and how it's taught, that you pick this up and read through it, because they're all really like fascinating looks at the historical kind of the things that we take for granted in schools, and how those are often built up out of myths or assumptions, and how proper teaching can dispel a lot of these myths and get a little bit closer to the heart, but also allow students to dispel these myths themselves. And I think that is a really powerful tool in their toolkit. If after my class, my students can go in and read something and say, I don't think that's true, and then find the opposing takes and create a kind of a answer to the question that is well informed and uses really good research skills, then I believe that as a history teacher, I've been successful. And I don't really care as much if they've learned all the little minutia that we have to teach them. If they can do that, I am personally very satisfied. But yeah, I believe that these two were really interesting and eye-opening for me personally. And I think that they're good case studies on how to do that properly.
Yeah, and I fully agree. I think one of the other things is to remember, like, it's important to know these historical events because it kind of shapes, how we got here. But I think also sort of the idea of critical thinking and being thoughtful in how you're looking at like information you're taking in, especially in this time that we're kind of, people are calling, sort of the era of fake news, or the
Mhm.
era of post-truth. It's more important than ever that students be able to engage with primary and secondary sources in a thoughtful and reasonable manner.
All right, well, that's all we have time for today. If you are interested in further lesson seeds or ideas, if you're listening to this, please feel free to look further in our Google site and email us with any questions that you may have.